The threshing bastion was not a station in any sense its builders would have permitted the word to imply, because a station suggested a place where ships paused on their way to somewhere better, and nothing that arrived at the bastion was permitted the dignity of a destination beyond it. It hung in the lightless trough between two dead suns, a kilometers-long spine of black ferroglass and reinforced compression plating. And it had been engineered with a single institutional purpose, which was to take recruits from 40 client species and reduce them, through pressure and privation and the slow grinding theater of fear, into instruments that obeyed before they understood the order. The coalition of bound spears called it a training fortress. The species who survived it called it the threshing floor, because grain went in whole and came out separated, the useful kernel from the chaff, and the bastion did not pretend the separation was gentle. Light inside it was a rationed thing, filtered through bands of amber emergency strip that ran along the floor seams rather than the ceilings, so that everyone walked through their own shadow at all times, and the architecture itself seemed designed to remind the small that they were small. Into this place, on a transfer manifest, flagged with the lowest possible priority code, came a single human, and the file that preceded him listed him under a designation that the orientation officers read twice and then laughed at, because the designation was salvage grade recruit, provisional, survival risk acceptable, and no one who carried that classification had ever finished a rotation alive. His name was Eli Marrow, and the first thing the Bastion got wrong about him was that it assumed his quiet was the quiet of a creature already calculating its own death. He was not tall. He stood a full head beneath the shortest of the Vren instructors and 2 heads beneath the Kisari, who ran the armory, and he had the build of someone who had spent his growing years carrying things heavier than himself across distances longer than was reasonable. His hands were the wrong color in the amber light, a warm brown that the cool institutional glow could not quite drain, and they were scarred in the particular way of hands that had worked with edges and engines, and the stubborn refusal of broken machinery to stay broken. He did not flinch at the dead suns through the viewport. He did not stare at the Kasari armorer's mandibles or the Vren drill officer's third arm. He looked at the bastion the way a man looks at a house he has been hired to repair, cataloging the cracks, and the orientation officer who processed him noted in the margin of his file that the human displayed an abnormal absence of appropriate intimidation response and recommended the standard corrective. The standard corrective at the threshing bastion was a creature named Drevis Hald, and he had not been wrong about a recruit in 19 rotations. Drevis Hald was Skarn, a species of high-gravity ridge dwellers whose bodies were sheathed in interlocking plates of keratinized bone and whose culture had elevated the management of fear into something close to a sacrament. He was the Bastion's senior threshing officer, which meant that every recruit who entered the fortress passed through the architecture of his judgment, and Dravus had built his entire long career on a single principle he considered as reliable as orbital mechanics, which was that every living thing could be measured by the precise weight of what it feared, and that a creature's fear, properly mapped, could be used to steer it like a vessel under tow. He did not raise his voice. He had learned long ago that the quietest officer in a room was the one the room watched. When Eli Marrow was brought before him, Drevis did not look at the human's face. He looked at the human's hands, and at the single item the transfer protocol had permitted the recruit to retain from his prior life, which sat on the intake table between them in a worn leather sheath, no longer than a scarred finger. Drevis reached out one armored digit and tipped it over, and the thing inside slid partway free. And it was a knife. A small one. A folding blade of plain carbon steel, the handle worn pale at the spine, where a thumb had ridden it 10,000 times, the cutting edge honed down narrow from decades of patient sharpening, the whole of it, perhaps, the length of a scarn's smallest claw. Drevis Hald looked at the tiny knife, and then he did something he almost never did in the intake chamber, which was that he made a sound of genuine amusement, a low-plated clicking from deep in his thorax. And the two Vren flanking the door took the permission of that sound and laughed. They laughed at the human's tiny knife. It was the kind of laughter that fills a cold room with a false warmth and then drains it twice as cold. And Eli Marrow stood through all of it, with his weight settled evenly on both feet and his eyes on the middle distance, the way a man stands at a bus stop in a weather he cannot change. He did not reach for the knife. He did not explain it. When the clicking subsided, Drevis slid the little blade back across the table with a contemptuous flick and informed the human, in the flat administrative tone he reserved for the already dead, that the Bastion permitted recruits one personal effect, not out of sentiment, but out of cruelty, so that each of them would carry into the threshing the precise object that proved how little their former life had prepared them for this one. Eli folded the knife closed with a single quiet motion of his thumb and returned it to its sheath, and returned the sheath to his belt, and said nothing at all, and it was the saying nothing that first lodged a small wrong note in the back of Drevis Hald's otherwise serene mind, because in 19 rotations every recruit had said something, and the ones who said nothing were usually the ones already calculating their death. And this human did not have the stillness of a creature calculating its death. He had the stillness of a creature who had already survived something the Bastion had not yet imagined. What the file did not say, because the file had been assembled by a clerk who had never left the inner coalition worlds, was where Eli Marrow had spent his growing years. He had spent them on a salvage hulk called the Margaret Dunn, a derelict ore hauler converted into a floating reclamation yard in the debris field of a collapsed mining colony, where his family and 40 other families made their living by going out in patched pressure suits and bringing back the broken things the colony had left behind when it died. There were no instructors there. There was no armory and no medical bay worth the name, and no margin at all for the kind of mistake that the Bastion's recruits made twice a day and survived because someone caught them. On the Margaret Dunn, a child learned to read the breath hour gauge before he learned to read words, learned that a frayed seal whispered before it screamed, learned that the difference between coming home and not coming home was very often a single small tool, and the patience to use it correctly in the dark with your air running out. Eli had buried his father at 14, suited up and went back out the same shift because the field did not stop being lethal to grief, and somewhere in those years he had become a thing the coalition had no classification for, which was a person to whom fear was simply information, useful in the way a temperature reading is useful, and never once permitted to take the wheel. The knife had been his father's. Drevis Hald did not know any of this, and would not have cared if he had, because Drevis had a reason to want the human dead that had nothing to do with the human at all, and everything to do with a discrepancy in the Bastion's reclamation ledgers that Drevis had spent the last 4 rotations carefully ensuring no one would ever find. The matter was this. The threshing Bastion consumed enormous quantities of material, and a percentage of that material was logged as expended in training when it was in fact being quietly diverted, rerouted through a falsified salvage recovery contract to a private holding that Drevis Hall did not technically own and could not technically be connected to, except by a single thread, which was that the falsified contract required a recovery operator with a salvage classification to sign the intake records and make the diversions look like legitimate reclamation. For 3 rotations, the Bastion had simply forged the signatures, because no actual salvage classified personnel were ever posted to a training fortress. And then, through the blind machinery of a transfer system that did not know what it was doing, the Bastion had been assigned an actual salvage-grade recruit, a living person whose classification matched the forged signatures exactly, and whose mere presence on the manifest would, the moment any auditor cross-referenced it, transform Drevis Hald's invisible crime into a documented one with a name attached to the recovery line. The human did not need to discover anything. The human did not need to do anything at all. He simply needed to exist on the Bastion's rolls long enough for the next quarterly audit, and Drevis Hald would be undone by the coincidence of a dead man's classification. And so, the senior threshing officer had made a quiet decision, the kind he had made before, which was that salvage-grade recruit Eli Marrow would not survive to the audit, and that his death would be unremarkable, accidental, and complete, swallowed by the very environment the Bastion existed to weaponize. The laughter at the tiny knife had been real. The decision underneath it had been older. The instrument of that decision was a unit the recruits called the Iron Choir, and they were the most decorated and most feared training cadre on the Bastion, a 5-member specialist team who ran the live environment exercises in the only place on the fortress that could kill you for free. The place was the Mantle, a sealed interior biome 40 levels deep in the Bastion's spine, where the Coalition had reconstructed, at ruinous expense, the surface conditions of a high-pressure ammonia world for the purpose of teaching recruits to operate in environments that did not want them. The air in the Mantle would freeze a Vren's blood and corrode a Kasari's lungs, and was breathable to no one without a rig. The light came down through a kilometer of suspended crystalline lattice that the engineers had grown rather than built, beautiful and pale and lethal, because the lattice resonated, and a sufficiently loud or sufficiently wrong sound would set it ringing at a frequency that shattered pressure seals from the inside. Recruits who trained in the Mantle moved quietly and breathed carefully, and died. When they died, in ways the incident reports described with the same flat administrative tone Drevis used for the living. The Iron Choir owned the Mantle the way a predator owns a watering hole. And into their custody, on the morning of his first deep rotation, walked Eli Marrow, with a salvage classification on his file, a target on his back that he could not see, and his father's knife in its sheath at his belt. The first member of the Iron Choir the human met was Var Solen, and she was the one Drevis had chosen to make the death happen. Var Solen was Kasari, a species of mantis-lean ambush hunters from a world of perpetual twilight, and she had been engineered by her own evolution into the finest infiltration specialist the Bastion had ever produced. She moved without displacing air. Her chitin shifted color against any surface she pressed it to, so that in the wrong light she was less a person than a suggestion that the wall might be lying. She had killed in 17 live environments, and she had never once been the thing a target watched, because by the time a target knew to watch her, the watching was already over. She had spent 400 rotations learning to read the precise moment a creature gave up, the small collapse of posture that meant the prey had accepted its death, and she had been told by Drevis Hald in a private channel that this human was to have an accident in the Mantle and that the timing was hers to choose. Var Solen looked at the small, soft, warm-skinned creature in its borrowed rig and cataloged it as the easiest assignment of her career. She gave it 3 days, The other 4 of the choir she did not bother to inform, because the choir did not discuss such things, and because the other 4 were occupied with their own contempt. There was Brakundol, the Vren demolitions and structures specialist, a slab of a creature with 3 arms and a perfectionist's hatred of imprecision, who took one look at the human's clumsy handling of the mantle's pressure rig and decided that the recruit was a liability who would get someone killed through sheer incompetence, and resolved to be standing well clear when it happened. There was Os, who had no other name the choir used, a Threll combat medic whose long, delicate manipulator digits could close a ruptured artery in the dark, and whose lower set of limbs could crush a recruit's ribcage as a disciplinary measure, and who regarded all recruits as future patients or future corpses, and saw no urgent reason to learn which this one would be. There was Hune Tavar, the choir's tracker, a low-slung quadruped of the Garn, whose entire body was a sensory instrument, reading the mantle's vibrations through the pads of his feet and the long, whiskered ridge of his spine, and who found the human's footfalls offensively loud and said so once, and then ignored him. And there was the one who led them, Sen Merrick, a Skarn like Drevis, but a generation younger and a great deal less corrupt, whose left eye had been replaced with a kinetic tracking augment that rendered the world to him as vectors and probabilities, and who looked at Eli Marrow through that augment on the first morning and saw a recruit with a survival probability, his instruments rounded down to 0, and ordered the human to the rear of the formation, where a dead man would be least in the way. The Iron Choir had laughed at the tiny knife when the intake report circulated. By the end of the first week, not one of them was laughing, and not one of them could have told you precisely when they had stopped. It began, as it always began, with Eli Marrow, with something small and unrequested. On the second day in the mantle, during a positioning drill, Brakundol's pressure rig developed a fault in its left shoulder seal, a slow weep of internal atmosphere that the Vren's own gauges had not yet caught because the leak was upstream of the sensor, in a coupling the manufacturer had placed in a location no Vren arm could comfortably reach. Bracken did not know he was losing air. He knew only that he felt, in a way he could not name, slightly and increasingly wrong. The human, positioned at the rear where he had been ordered, watched the demolition specialist for the length of one drill cycle and then crossed the formation without permission, which was itself a punishable act, and stopped behind Bracken, and did not speak, and reached up with both warm-colored hands and did something to the back of the Vren shoulder rig that took 11 seconds. The weeping stopped. Bracken's gauges, a full minute later, registered the atmosphere they had not known they were losing, and the Vren turned, 3 arms coming up in the reflexive aggression posture of his kind, to find the human already walking back to his assigned position at the rear, having said nothing, having asked for nothing, having performed the repair as though maintaining the structural integrity of a teammate's gear were simply an undeniable law of physics that applied to him whether anyone was watching or not. Brakundol stood for a long moment in the pale, lethal light of the mantle, 3 arms half raised, no enemy to use them on, and felt the first hairline crack appear in a certainty he had not known was load-bearing. The human had not looked at the gauge. There had been no gauge to look at. The human had read the leak some other way, through the sound of it perhaps, or the smell, or some salvage yard sense the Vren had no equivalent for, had read a failure the rig's own instruments could not yet see, and had crossed an entire formation to fix it for a creature who had spent the week treating him as garbage. Bracken was a perfectionist. His entire identity was built on the proposition that he was the most precise instrument in any room. And he had just been outread on the matter of his own equipment by a soft, small thing the Bastion had classified as acceptable to lose. He did not thank the human. He did not mention it. That night, in the choir's barracks, when Hune Tavar made the loud footfalls remark again, Brackendahl said nothing, and his silence was a different shape than it had been the day before. Hune Tavar noticed the silence before he understood it, because Hune noticed everything, and noticing was the second crack. The Garn tracker read the world through vibration, and the mantle was a symphony of it. The deep groan of the pressure hull, the high constant whisper of the crystalline lattice 40 meters overhead, the individual signatures of every creature's footfalls written into the deck plating. Hune had built his contempt for the human on the recruit's footfalls, which were heavier than a Kesseri's and clumsier than a Skarn's, and which announced the human's position to anyone with the sense to feel the floor. On the fifth day, however, Hune Tavar felt something through his pads that he did not at first believe, and then felt it again, and could not unfeel. The human's footfalls had changed, not grown lighter. The human's mass was the human's mass, but changed in their timing, falling now between the pulses of the hull's compression cycle, landing in the troughs of the deck's own vibration, where they made the least sound, as though the human had spent 5 days listening to a rhythm Hune had assumed was inaudible to a creature with such crude senses, and had quietly taught himself to walk inside it. No one had instructed him. There was no instruction for it. The human had simply listened to the floor the way Hune listened to it, with no equipment, and no training, and no apparent effort, and had begun to move through the mantle the way a thing belonged there. Hune Tavar stopped mid-patrol and pressed his whole spine ridge flat to the deck and read the human's progress across the biome. And what he read was a creature moving with more acoustic discipline than 2 of the choir's own members. Hune Tavar's threat assessment of the human revised itself in the space of a single breath, and it did not revise upward toward respect. It revised sideways, toward a category the Garn had only a few words for, the category of things that watch you while pretending not to, and Hune began, from that day, to watch the human back. The competence cascade did not announce itself. That was the thing the choir could not get a grip on. Eli Marrow never demonstrated. He never showed off, never explained, never once acted as though any of it were difficult or remarkable or worth a witness. He repaired what was broken because it was broken. He moved quietly because the lattice overhead would kill them all if he did not. He read the mantle's daily failures, the seal that would weep tomorrow, the coupling that had been over-torqued, the lattice node that hummed a half-tone wrong. With the offhand certainty of a man reading weather, he had grown up inside, and when the specialists noticed, which they increasingly did, he gave them nothing to push against, no arrogance to resent, no claim to dispute. Osthemedic, who measured all creatures by their relationship to injury, watched the human go an entire rotation without sustaining a single one, in an environment that injured the choir's own members weekly, and revised the human from future corpse to a third unnamed category that the Threll had encountered perhaps 4 times in a long career. The category of patients who do not come to the medic because they do not break. And Var Solen, who had given the human 3 days to die, watched all of this from the colorless edge of every room and did not move. She told herself it was patience, The infiltration specialist's first virtue was patience, and an accident that came too early was an accident that invited questions. And so, she waited and watched and told herself that the watching was professional. Var Solen had spent 400 rotations learning to read the moment a creature accepted its death. However, and as the days accumulated, she was forced to confront a thing her instincts found intolerable, which was that this human had no such moment in him. She watched for it constantly. She watched him in the lethal mantle and in the freezing transit corridors and in the rationed amber dark of the recruit bunks, and she never once saw the small collapse of posture, the giving up, the acceptance she had built her entire lethal art around finding. The human was afraid. She could see that he was afraid in the careful way he checked his rig and the deliberate economy of his movements. But the fear in him did not steer. It sat where information sat. It informed and did not command. And Var Solen, watching a creature feel fear and decline to obey it, felt for the first time in 400 rotations the cold, uncertain edge of a thing she did not have a hunting word for, because every prey she had ever taken had given her the moment, and this one simply would not. And a target that will not give you the moment is not, she began to understand, a target at all. It is a variable, and variables, in her long, brutal experience, were the things that got hunters killed. She did not report this to Dravis Hald. That was the first decision she made that she could not fully justify to herself. The warmth object, when it came through the one part of the bastion's design that even the threshing floor could not make cruel, which was the heat. 40 levels of pressure hull bled their thermal load into a single recovery junction outside the mantle's airlock, and the recruits and cadre who cycled out of the lethal cold biome passed through that junction to thaw. And the junction was always too small, and the wait was always too long, and the cold went very deep before the warmth reached the bone. On the 9th day, Eli Marrow came out of the mantle behind hewn Tavar, and the Garn was shaking in the particular way of a quadruped whose long, low body presented too much surface to the cold, his vibration reading pads gone numb and clumsy, and the human did a thing that no recruit had ever done in the recovery junction, which was to take a battered thermal canister from his own rig, a salvager's tool for warming frozen couplings, and set it down on the deck between Hune's front pads without a word, and step back and busy himself with his own gear as though the canister had simply migrated there on its own. The canister threw a small, steady heat. Hune Tavar looked at it for a long time. Then he extended his numpads over it, and the warmth reached his sensory ridge, and his shaking eased, and he did not look at the human, and the human did not look at him. When the rotation cycled out, Hune did not return the canister to the human's rig. He carried it, and on the next cold cycle he set it down between Os and the wall, and the medic warmed her manipulators over it without comment, and on the cycle after that, the canister appeared, by a rote no one acknowledged, between Brak Kundol's 3 arms, and the demolition specialist held his hands above it, and said nothing, and passed it, the following day, to Sen Marek. The small, steady heat moved through the iron choir hand to hand, to pad, to manipulator across the rotations that followed. A warmth no one had requested, and no one named, and not one member of the choir ever once acknowledged aloud where it had come from, or what it meant that they kept passing it on. The human watched the canister travel the circuit of the unit he had been assigned to as a sacrifice, and his expression did not change, and he asked for nothing. Var Solen watched the canister too, and understood in the cold infiltrator's part of her that cataloged everything, that the human had introduced a thing into the choir's closed lethal economy that the choir had no defense against, and that the thing was not a weapon, and that this was somehow worse. Drevis hauled, monitoring the mantle through the bastion surveillance lattice from the warm administrative levels above, saw none of the warmth and all of the wrong numbers. The human was supposed to be dead by now. The infiltration specialist's reports came back clipped and procedural and empty of the one word Drevis was waiting for, and the quarterly audit advanced toward the bastion like a tide, and the senior threshing officer began for the first time in 19 rotations to feel the precise temperature reading he spent his life inducing in others. So he made the decision he should have made first, the decision that did not rely on the patience of a specialist who had inexplicably gone slow, and he reached into the part of the mantle's machinery that only he and the engineering corps could touch. And he began, across 3 quiet nights, to arrange an accident that would not require Varsolen's cooperation at all. He retuned the crystalline lattice. He shifted 4 of its resonance nodes a fraction of a tone toward the frequency that shattered seals, and he set the shift on a timer, and he scheduled the human's unit for a deep mantle exercise on the morning the timer would mature. And he told himself, in the internally consistent way of a creature who had built his safety on a false structure, that he was not a murderer, but a custodian of necessary outcomes, and that the human's death would be the mantle's doing, and not his own. What Drevis Hall did not account for, because it had never once been relevant in 19 rotations, was that one of the recruits in that morning's exercise had spent his childhood listening to the difference between a sound that was wrong and a sound that was about to be fatal. The deep exercise began in the pale lattice light, with the iron choir spread in their patrol formation, and the human at the rear, where Sen Merrick, still out of habit, more than judgment, placed him. They went down through the mantle's lower galleries, past the grown crystalline columns that the lattice fed, into the deep biome where the ammonia atmosphere lay thickest and the pressure pressed hardest on the rigs. And the exercise was a navigation problem, a route to find through the resonance hazard, the kind of thing the choir had run 1,000 times. They were 40 minutes in, deep in a gallery where the lattice hung low and close overhead, when Eli Marrow stopped walking. He stopped the way Hune Tavar had learned to stop, between the pulses of the hull, and he tilted his head, and he listened to the lattice, and what he heard in it was a note that had not been there in 9 days of listening, a fractional wrongness in 4 of the nodes above the gallery, a tightening toward a frequency. His body knew the way. It knew the whisper of a frayed seal, because the salvage fields had taught him before he could read that some sounds are the sound of a structure deciding to fail. He did not have the coalition's word for resonance cascade. He had the salvager's word, which was simply that the ceiling was about to scream. The human did not call out, because a shout in that gallery, with the nodes already tightening, would itself have been enough to tip them over the edge. Instead, he moved fast and low and silent up the formation he had spent 2 weeks being kept at the back of, and he took hold of Sen Merrick's arm, the squad leader who had rounded his survival probability to 0, and he pulled hard in the direction of a maintenance recess in the gallery wall that the choir had passed without noticing, because it was not on their route. Sen Merrick's kinetic augment read the human's motion as a vector of impossible urgency, and his instincts, 4 generations of Skarn discipline, told him to resist a recruit's unauthorized contact, and for half a second the squad leader hung between 2 truths. Then he looked where the human was looking, up at the 4 nodes, and his augment caught what the human's ears had caught A full beat before any instrument would, the nodes beginning to harmonize, and Sen Merrick stopped resisting and started moving and shouted the one order the choir would obey without question, which was the order to seal and shelter, and pointed at the recess the human had already chosen. The choir moved. They were the finest specialist unit on the bastion, and when their leader gave the order, they moved as one organism into the recess, low and fast, and Os, the medic, last in because she had paused to drag a slower bracken, was 3 steps from the recess when the lattice screamed. The sound was not a sound. It was a pressure, a wall of resonance that hit the gallery like the inside of a struck bell, and the 4 retuned nodes shattered their grown crystalline columns into a storm of fragments and decompression that swept the gallery floor. And Os, the medic, was caught at the edge of it. Her rig's left side breached in an instant, the lethal ammonia atmosphere finding the gap, her long, delicate manipulators already going stiff as the cold and the corrosion reached them. She went down 2 steps from the recess. The choir, sealed in the recess, could not reach her without breaching their own shelter into the still screaming gallery, and Os's own rig was failing too fast for her to crawl, and Sen Merrick's augment gave the medic a survival window his instruments measured in single seconds. Eli Marrow was already moving before the window opened because he had not gone into the recess. He had stayed in the gallery. He had stayed because his salvager's body had done the arithmetic faster than thought. The arithmetic of a man who had spent his life in fields where the lethal thing and the saving thing occupied the same 3 seconds, and he had positioned himself in the half-beat before the scream, not in the shelter, but behind the one piece of cover the gallery offered, a fallen column section that broke the resonance wall's path. When Os went down, he came out from behind it, low, into the storm the choir could not enter, and he reached the medic in the time her rig had left, and he did the thing he had carried in a worn leather sheath at his belt for 2 weeks while 5 specialists laughed at it. He drew the tiny knife. The breach in Os's rig was at the left shoulder coupling, the same class of coupling Bracken's rig had wept from on the 2nd day, a manufacturer's seal seated in a recess too tight for any of the choir's tools or any of their thick specialist digits, and the regulation rig repair kit, the one the bastion issued and the one the choir carried, used a sealing wand too broad to reach the breach before the medic's blood froze. The tiny folding knife was not too broad. Its blade had been honed down narrow across decades of a salvager's patient sharpening, narrow enough to slip into the coupling recess, and its spine was worn pale where a thumb had ridden it 10,000 times, and Eli Marrow rode it now with the same thumb, fast and exact in the screaming dark, and he used the small narrow blade to lever the breached seal clear and to score and seat the emergency patch from his own rig into the coupling in a sequence of motions so economical that Sen Merrick's augment, recording all of it, would later count the steps and find there were only 5. He pressed. He cracked the patch's adhesive seal against the cold. He levered the failed coupling clear with the knife's narrow edge. He seated the patch with the flat of his thumb. He stepped back, and Os's rig, breech sealed, atmosphere holding, registered the pressure it had been about to lose, and the medic, who measured all creatures by their relationship to injury, lay on the gallery floor in the dying scream of the lattice and looked up at the small, warm-colored creature, folding a tiny knife closed with one thumb, and understood that she was not going to be a corpse today, because the most expendable recruit on the bastion had run into a thing the Iron Choir had run away from. Carrying the joke they had all laughed at. The lattice scream guttered and died. The gallery went quiet. The deep ringing silence of a struck bell finally still. For 3 full seconds in the pale settling light, absolute silence reigned, and into that silence Ely Marrow returned the small knife to its sheath at his belt, and crossed to where the choir was already emerging from the recess, and put his shoulder under Ossa's good side to lift her, and said nothing at all, and asked for nothing. And the 5 members of the Iron Choir looked at the recruit they had been given as a sacrifice and recalibrated, all at once and all in silence, everything they had believed about the species and the classification and the size of the threat. Sen Marek's augment had recorded the retuned nodes. That was the thing that turned a rescue into a reckoning, because the squad leader was not corrupt, only cold. And when he reviewed the recording in the administrative quiet after the medic was stable, he saw what his instruments had caught in the half-second before the scream, which was that the 4 nodes had not failed. They had been moved. The resonance signature, was not the chaos of a structural fault, but the clean ordered shift of a deliberate retuning. 4 nodes walked a precise fraction of a tone toward the shatter frequency by a hand with access to the mantle's core machinery. And there were exactly 2 creatures on the bastion with that access, and one of them was the engineering core, and the other had personally scheduled this unit for this gallery on this morning. Sen Marek did not yet have the why. He had the cold-ordered fact of an arranged accident, and a recruit whose survival had turned the accident into evidence, and he was a Skarn who had spent his whole career adjacent to Dravis Hald's serene certainty and had never before had a reason to question where that certainty was anchored. He sealed the recording behind his own authorization, and he said nothing, and he began, quietly, to look. Varsolen looked too, and she looked faster, because the infiltration specialist had spent the entire exercise where she always was, at the colorless edge, and she had seen the human stay in the gallery, and she had done the arithmetic of it before the lattice even broke. She had been ordered to give this human an accident, and someone else, going around her, had arranged one without her, which meant that Dravis Hald no longer trusted his infiltration specialist to complete a contract, which meant that Varsolen herself had become, in the calculus of the senior threshing officer, a loose thread adjacent to a crime. She understood her own position with the clarity of her kind. She had hunted for Dravis Hald for 400 rotations, and the moment she had hesitated over a target, she had become a target, and the only living creature on the bastion who had demonstrated the ability to survive what Dravis arranged was the small warm thing she had been sent to kill. Varsolen was not sentimental. She did not soften. She made, instead, the cold strategic decision of an ambush hunter who has correctly identified the larger predator in the room, and she went to Sen Marek with what she knew, the contract and the order and the timing. And the 2 of them laid the infiltrator's knowledge beside the squad leader's recording, and the shape of Dravis Hald's invisible crime began at last to become visible. The reckoning, when it came, was not loud. The threshing bastion did not produce loud reckonings. The quarterly audit arrived on schedule, and the auditors, a humorless 3-member assessment cell from the Coalition's inspectorate, were met at the docking spine by Sen Marek of the Iron Choir, who presented them with a sealed kinetic recording of a deliberately retuned resonance lattice, and by Varsolen, who presented them with the falsified salvage recovery contract and the routing of the diverted materiel, and the single thread that connected all of it to a holding that Drevis Hald did not technically own, and the auditors cross-referenced the recovery line, as auditors always would, and found on it the forged signature of a salvage classification, and found on the Bastion's rolls the living recruit whose real classification had been the coincidence Drevis had been so desperate to erase, and found the recruit very much alive, having survived the accident, meant to erase him, having, in the surviving, become the precise documented proof the whole crime had been arranged to prevent. Eli Marrow gave the auditors a brief, flat account of the rescue and the breach and the coupling, and showed them, when they asked, the small folding knife, and did not editorialize, and did not accuse, and let the ordered facts do what ordered facts do to a structure built on a lie. Drevis Hald was relieved of his post in a closed administrative proceeding 2 levels above the mantle, and the proceeding was quiet, and the human was not present for it, because the Bastion's design kept the punishment of the powerful and the survival of the small in separate sealed rooms, and that separation was the one mercy the threshing floor had ever shown anyone. The diverted materiel was traced. The holding was unwound. The senior threshing officer who had measured every living thing by the weight of its fear was removed by an inspectorate that did not fear him at all, and the last anyone of the iron choir saw of him was a plated figure being walked down the docking spine between 2 auditors, no longer the quietest creature in any room, and Eli Marrow, had he been asked, would have had nothing to say about it, because he had never been hunting Drevis Hald. He had only been repairing what was broken, the way he always had, and the Bastion had simply turned out to be more broken than most. The human finished his rotation. That was the part the file had said was impossible, and the file was rewritten. The final morning, the iron choir cycled out of the mantle for the last time before the unit's rotation reset, up through the lower galleries in the deep biome, and out through the airlock into the recovery junction where the heat bled in too slow and the cold went deep before it left the bone. They came through in their patrol order, the medic Oss moving without a limp because the breach had been sealed in time, the tracker Hune reading the deck out of habit, the perfectionist Bracken checking his shoulder seal that no longer wept, the squad leader Sen Merrick with his augment quiet, and at the rear, where he had been placed on the first morning as a dead man, least in the way, the human. In the recovery junction, the battered thermal canister sat on the deck where it had ended its long, unacknowledged circuit, throwing its small steady heat, and the choir gathered around it in the cold, to thaw. And Eli Marrow came in last and stood at the edge of the group the way the smallest thing in a hostile room stands at the edge of it, out of long habit, expecting the edge. It was Varsolin who moved first, and she moved the way she did everything, without displacing air, so that the human did not register it until it was done. She shifted, a single quiet step, and the gap she opened was not at the edge. It was in the circle between herself and Hune Tavar, a space exactly the width of a small, warm-colored creature. And she did not look at the human when she opened it, and she did not say anything, because the iron choir did not discuss such things. She simply made the room, and went still again, and waited to see what the variable would do. Eli Marrow looked at the gap in the circle. Then he stepped into it, into the small, steady heat, between the infiltration specialist who had been sent to kill him and the tracker who had once found his footfalls offensively loud, and he warmed his scarred, warm-colored hands over the canister he had set down 9 days ago between a stranger's frozen pads, and not one member of the iron choir said a word, and not one of them needed to. The heat reached the bone. the dead suns hung in the viewport, and the small knife sat in its worn leather sheath at the human's belt, folded closed, where a thumb had ridden the spine pale across 2 lifetimes of patient work. And no one in the recovery junction was laughing, because the debrief had been very quiet, and the quiet had said everything the threshing floor had spent 19 rotations trying to make impossible to say.